Before we go any further, viewer discretion is advised. What you are about to hear is not light entertainment, nor is it harmless daytime chatter. This content confronts power, ego, and ideology head-on, and it does so without apology. What happens when the immovable object of empirical truth collides with the unstoppable force of performative outrage? What happens when a 93-year-old intellectual titan, a man born into the crushing poverty of the segregated American South, hardened by the discipline of the United States Marine Corps, and sharpened by decades of rigorous scholarship in the most demanding academic institutions in the world, walks calmly into a setting designed not to challenge ideas, but to humiliate a guest? What happens when the trap fails? We are often told that daytime television is harmless, a place of fluff. A landscape of coordinated smiles, safe opinions, soft questions, and carefully rehearsed banter designed to offend no one and enlighten no one. We are told it exists purely to entertain, to pass the hours between school drop-offs and lunch breaks. But history has a way of mocking our assumptions. The most consequential ideological battles of our time are not always fought in the halls of Congress or beneath the vaulted ceilings of Ivy League lecture theaters. Sometimes they erupt under unforgiving studio lights, between a commercial for laundry detergent and a segment on celebrity gossip, where truth is least expected and therefore least defended. What unfolded on that Tuesday morning was not a debate. To call it a debate would imply equal footing, mutual curiosity, and a shared respect for evidence. What happened instead was something far more decisive. It was an execution of narratives, of assumptions, and of the comfortable illusions that define the modern media elite. This was the day Thomas Sowell, arguably one of the greatest living economists and social philosophers of the last century, walked onto the set of The View and calmly dismantled the moral theater constructed around him. Layer by layer, with surgical precision, he peeled back the hypocrisy that underpins so much of contemporary discourse. It was also the day Whoopi Goldberg, the undisputed queen of daytime talk television, realized far too late that she had brought a script to a gunfight. She expected a frail old man, someone she could lecture, someone whose age could be used as a shield for condescension, someone whose lived experience could be politely ignored in favor of rehearsed talking points. Instead, she encountered something far more dangerous, an individual who had lived too long, seen too much, and studied too deeply to be intimidated by a television host. This is the story of the interview they later tried to forget. This is the moment that could not be edited out fast enough. This is when the working class found its voice, not in a shout, not in rage, but in the terrifying calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. The Tuesday morning at the ABC studios on Manhattan's Upper West Side began with deceptive tranquility. Everything appeared normal, even sterile. Behind the scenes, the machinery of the show hummed with its usual controlled chaos. Production assistants sprinted down narrow corridors with headsets pressed tightly to their ears, barking countdowns and reminders into handheld radios. Clipboards were clutched like life rafts. Makeup artists performed last, miracles under harsh fluorescent lights, smoothing stress and fatigue into something presentable for national television. The studio audience was being whipped into a frenzy of artificial enthusiasm by a warm-up comic, trained to generate applause on command. Laughter was practiced, smiles were rehearsed. The air itself smelled of hairspray, hot lights, and the faint metallic tang of electricity. Ozone produced by a room saturated with cameras and expectation. Everything was exactly as it always was, until Thomas Sowell arrived. He did not enter with an entourage. There were no publicists fluttering nervously around him, no assistants carrying garment bags or bottled water preferences. He made no demands about lighting, seating, or camera angles, no rider, no ego. He walked in quietly, dressed simply, carrying nothing but decades of accumulated knowledge and an unshakable sense of clarity. Those who noticed him immediately felt the shift. Conversation softened, movement slowed. There was something unsettling about his presence, not because it was loud, but because it was anchored. He had the posture of someone who had endured real adversity, not manufactured outrage. Someone who had survived eras far more brutal than a hostile interview. Born into poverty in the Jim Crow South, orphaned at a young age, Educated through relentless self-discipline rather than privilege, Sowell's life story alone contradicted many of the narratives routinely weaponized on television. Add to that his service in the Marine Corps, his academic rigor, and his unwillingness to flatter ideological trends, and you had a guest who could not be easily controlled. The producers thought they were inviting a relic. They had invited a reckoning. From the control room, everything still looked manageable. The hosts reviewed their notes. Segments were timed. Commercial breaks were locked in. The assumption was simple. Sowell would speak, they would respond, and the show would move on. But they underestimated the danger of truth delivered calmly. They underestimated the power of someone who does not need applause. And they underestimated the fact that when someone has survived genuine hardship, moral theater loses its effectiveness. What followed was not chaos. It was worse for them. It was clarity, and clarity, in a world built on performance, is the most disruptive force of all. There was no procession announcing him, no handlers clearing a path, no whispered reverence trailing his arrival. He entered the building as he had entered most rooms in his life, quietly, without ceremony, without expectation of accommodation. A slender cane supported his movement, its steady tap against the polished floor, marking time rather than haste. His steps were slow, measured, deliberate, the kind that belonged to a man who understood that urgency was often a performance, and that importance never needed to announce itself. He wore a tweed jacket that seemed to resist the present moment, as though it had been stitched for a world that no longer existed. The fabric spoke of durability, not fashion, of winters endured rather than trends followed. A sensible tie rested neatly against a crisp shirt, and his shoes, polished but worn thing, carried the unmistakable evidence of decades spent walking through history rather than watching it unfold on screens. His face bore no trace of anxiety or anticipation. Instead, it held a profound, observant stillness, the look of someone who had spent a lifetime watching patterns repeat, ideologies rise and fall, certainties harden and then crumble. Thomas Sowell moved through the backstage chaos like a ghost from a time when dignity was assumed, not demanded. Around him, the machinery of modern television churned relentlessly. Assistants hurried past with clipboards clutched tightly to their chests. Producers barked instructions into headsets, their voices layered over one another in a cacophony of countdowns and corrections. Phones vibrated endlessly, screens flickered. The entire space pulsed with artificial urgency, every person operating under the belief that the next 30 seconds might determine everything. Sowell remained untouched by it all. He advanced at his own pace, neither resisting nor responding to the frenzy. He had lived through eras where chaos was not simulated for ratings, but imposed by law, violence, and poverty. Compared to that, this was noise. When a young production runner, barely out of college, earnest and anxious, stepped forward and gently suggested they needed to move a little faster to make the green room on time, Sowell stopped. The moment was subtle but unmistakable. He did not raise his voice. He did not express irritation. He simply paused, turned his head, and looked directly at the young man. The gaze carried no hostility, no superiority, only calm acknowledgment. A quiet recognition of the difference between youth and experience, between borrowed authority and earned perspective. After a brief moment, he nodded once, politely, and resumed walking at precisely the same pace as before. The message required no explanation. He was 93 years old. He had grown up in the Jim Crow South. He had witnessed segregation enforced not by outrage, but by law. He had served in the military. He had studied ideologies that killed millions not in theory, but in practice. He was not going to be rushed by a 22-year-old intern armed with a stopwatch and a sense of borrowed urgency. Inside the studio, everything had already been carefully arranged. The iconic curved table gleamed beneath the studio lights. Whoopi Goldberg sat at its center, her posture relaxed, her presence undeniable. She radiated the ease of someone who had occupied power for so long that she no longer needed to signal it. Her authority was casual, assumed, reinforced by decades of cultural relevance. To her left sat Joy Behar, restless, energized, flipping through cue cards with the intensity of a seasoned prosecutor preparing to make her case. Her lips moved silently as she rehearsed her lines, testing phrasing, sharpening emphasis. Each question was designed not merely to ask, but to frame, to corner. Sunny Hostin adjusted her glasses, pen poised above her notepad. Her expression was focused, analytical, already anticipating responses that had not yet been given. This was not curiosity. It was preparation, strategy. 5 minutes to air. A stage manager shouted, his voice cutting through the room as his eyes swept the floor. The announcement sent a ripple through the studio. Conversations tightened, movements quickened, energy sharpened. Whoopi leaned toward Joy, covering her mouth as she whispered something unheard by anyone else. Joy listened, then smiled. They both chuckled softly. It was not the laughter of amusement. It was knowing, conspiratorial, the sound of people confident they were standing on the correct side of history, safely insulated by applause and consensus. They knew the plan. This was supposed to be a teaching moment. The producers had framed it carefully. The audience would see a respected but aging conservative intellectual brought into a modern, compassionate space. The hosts would challenge him politely but firmly. They would highlight what they believed were his blind spots, his outdated assumptions, his perceived lack of empathy. The conversation would be guided, controlled, and ultimately resolved in their favor. It would be framed as progress. They would speak, he would respond, the narrative would move on. What they did not understand was that Thomas Sowell had never confused intentions with outcomes. He had spent a lifetime studying consequences, the kind that linger long after applause fades. When he took his seat, he did so quietly. He adjusted himself with care, placed his cane neatly beside the chair, folded his hands loosely in front of him, and waited. He did not scan the audience. He did not seek affirmation. He did not perform. There was no nervousness, no defensiveness, no desire to impress, only readiness. And we are live in 3, 2, 1. The red tally light flared to life. The applause sign flashed, and the audience erupted into perfectly timed enthusiasm, smiles wide, hands clapping, unaware of the collision about to unfold. Whoopi smiled her familiar smile, warm, expansive, confident. The smile of someone who believed she was steering the moment. "Welcome back, everyone," she said smoothly. The words floated across the studio, but beneath the surface, something had already shifted. Because sitting just feet away from her was a man who had outlived movements, outlasted trends, and survived realities far harsher than televised outrage. A man who did not mistake performance for truth. A man who understood that history was not written by applause, but by consequences. And as the cameras rolled and the audience cheered, one thing was certain, though no one on set yet realized it. "Today we have a very special guest," Whoopi Goldberg announced, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of a seasoned host who had introduced thousands of people before. A legendary economist, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and the author of a new book that's stirring up quite the conversation. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Sowell. The cue was given. The applause sign lit up. Thomas Sowell rose slowly from his chair and walked into view. The applause that greeted him was polite, measured, respectful, but unmistakably restrained. It lacked the thunderous enthusiasm reserved for pop stars, viral personalities, or the latest reality television spectacle. This was not celebrity worship. This was acknowledgement, recognition without reverence. He did not seem to notice the difference. Sowell made his way to the table with quiet deliberation, his cane tapping softly against the studio floor. He took his seat at the far end, carefully placing the cane beside his chair, aligning it neatly with the leg as if order itself were a habit he could not abandon. He folded his hands on the glass surface of the table and waited. "It is good to be here," he said. The sound of his voice startled the room. In an era dominated by shouting pundits, performative outrage, and artificially elevated excitement, Sowell spoke in a deep baritone rumble barely above a whisper. There was no urgency in it, no attempt to command attention through volume. Instead, it did something far more powerful. It forced everyone to lean in. Conversations in the audience stopped, heads tilted forward. Even the crew seemed to pause. The room adjusted itself to him. "We're glad you could make the trip," Joy Behar said, smiling tightly, her tone carrying the faintest trace of condescension. "You know, at your age, most people are relaxing on a beach somewhere, but you just keep writing." Sowell's mouth curved almost imperceptibly at the corners. The problems of the world do not retire, he replied calmly, so neither can the analysis of them. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. It was genuine, unforced, a soft moment of charm that disarmed without trying to. For the next 7 minutes everything unfolded exactly as planned. They discussed inflation, numbers, trends, historical parallels. They spoke about housing markets, supply and demand, the long-term effects of policy decisions made decades earlier. It was academic, restrained, safe. Sowell answered each question with precision and economy, never wandering, never embellishing. He did not lecture, he did not posture. He spoke as someone accustomed to being understood, or ignored, without complaint. But behind the scenes, something felt off. The veteran cameraman noticed it first. Then the producers in the control booth. Whoopi Goldberg was unusually quiet. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't cracking jokes. She wasn't steering the conversation. She was watching. Her eyes stayed fixed on Sowell, following every movement, every pause, every inflection. They were narrowed slightly, alert, calculating. She was waiting, not for a mistake, but for comfort, for complacency, for the moment when the old man might relax just enough to be caught off guard. She was letting him talk. It was a classic ambush strategy. Lull the guest into a sense of safety. Let them explain themselves. Let them grow confident. And then, when the audience least expects it, strike with the question designed not to explore, but to expose. The kind of question that reframes the entire conversation and turns applause into judgment. What Whoopi did not understand was that Thomas Sowell did not have a guard to lower. He had spent nearly 9 decades navigating systems far more hostile than a television studio. His ideas had been attacked in classrooms, dismissed by institutions, misrepresented by critics who never read beyond headlines. What stood behind him was not defensiveness, but a fortress of intellect, built brick by brick through lived experience, disciplined study, and an unromantic understanding of reality. He saw the trap coming long before it was sprung. The shift happened just after the 8-minute mark. You could feel it. Sowell had just finished speaking about the dignity of labor, about small business owners who survived not because of slogans or sympathy, but because of resilience, sacrifice, and long hours invisible to policy debates. "That's a very nice sentiment, Thomas," Whoopi said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. In its place was something colder, sharper. She leaned forward slightly, crossing her arms on the table. The body language alone signaled what was coming next. "It sounds very romantic," she continued. "The struggling shop owner, the bootstrapper. It's a great story for a book." She paused. The audience quieted. The laughter evaporated. The air itself seemed to tighten. "But let's talk about the real world," Whoopi said, her voice rising just enough to carry authority. "You talk about dignity and hard work as if those are the only things that matter, but aren't you ignoring the reality that for millions of people in this country, people who look like you and me, the game is rigged?" She leaned in closer now. "The system," she said slowly, deliberately, "is designed to crush them." The question hung in the air like a verdict already written. Thomas Sowell did not blink. He did not shift in his chair. He did not recoil. He did not rush to defend himself. He turned his head slowly to face her. His expression remained calm, almost serene, but his eyes changed. The softness disappeared, replaced by something harder, sharper. Like flint struck against stone, this was not surprise. This was recognition. The ambush had arrived right on schedule. And for the first time since the cameras went live, the balance of power in the room began to move. Not toward outrage, not toward applause, but toward something far more dangerous for live television. Truth spoken without fear, and Thomas Sowell was just getting started. Just 2 words, flat, neutral, almost weightless, and yet they landed with more force than Whoopi's entire monologue. "Yes, the system," Whoopi shot back, her voice rising as she gestured broadly toward the audience, inviting them into her indignation. "You sit here and tell people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But some people don't have boots, Thomas. Isn't it a bit privileged for you to sit there and lecture the working class about responsibility when the deck is stacked against them from the moment they're born?" A collective breath swept through the studio. This was the strike, not a disagreement, an indictment. She wasn't challenging his data. She was challenging his moral legitimacy, framing him as the out-of-touch intellectual. The elitist, worse, the traitor, the man who had escaped hardship only to deny it to others. It was a deeply personal accusation, wrapped carefully in the language of compassion and justice, sharpened just enough to wound without appearing cruel. Joy Behar nodded vigorously beside her, seizing the opening. "She's right, Thomas," Joy said. "The inequality metrics are staggering. The numbers don't lie." Sowell took a breath. It was slow, deliberate. Measured, the kind of breath a man takes not to steady himself, but to give others time to finish embarrassing themselves. A lesser man would have rushed to defend his character. A defensive man would have raised his voice. Sowell did neither. He simply waited, let the echo of Whoopi's accusation fade, let the silence settle thick and uncomfortable over the studio. Then he spoke. "I am not ignoring anything, Whoopi," Sowell said. His voice was still quiet, but it had changed. It now carried a rough, granular texture, like stone grinding against stone. Every word felt earned. "I am simply refusing to insult the intelligence of the people you claim to protect." Whoopi blinked. The reaction was instant, invisible. That was not the response she had anticipated. "Insult them," she said sharply. "I'm fighting for them. I'm saying they are victims of a predatory capitalist machine. How is that an insult?" Sowell leaned forward, just an inch. The movement was subtle, but the effect was electric. "Because," he said evenly, "when you tell a man that he is a victim, you are not helping him. You are paralyzing him." A murmur rippled through the audience. "You are telling the plumber, the truck driver, the single mother working 2 shifts." Sowell continued that their efforts are meaningless, that no matter what they do, the system is too powerful for them to overcome, that their struggle is not a challenge to be met, but a sentence to be endured. Joy leaned in, sensing momentum slipping away from Whoopi. "They are victims," she interjected. "Thomas, look at the history. Look at the systemic barriers." "I have looked at the history, Joy," Sowell replied calmly, cutting her off without even turning his head. His eyes never left Whoopi. "I have lived the history." The room went still. "I grew up in a house with no electricity," Sowell said. "No hot water. I have known hunger not as a concept, but as a routine. I have seen poverty that would make the modern definition of struggle look like a luxury experience." Whoopi shifted slightly in her seat. "And what history tells me," Sowell continued, "is that when you strip a man of his agency, when you tell him that forces beyond his control define his destiny, you do not liberate him, you cage him. A beat. You replace responsibility with resentment," he said, "effort with entitlement, and hope with anger." Whoopi frowned. "So you're saying inequality doesn't exist?" "No," Sowell replied instantly. "I am saying that inequality has always existed, and that the societies which progress are not the ones that promise equality of outcome, but the ones that preserve equality of opportunity." Sunny Hostin leaned forward now. "But opportunity isn't equal," she said. "Access to education, housing, health care has expanded dramatically over the last half-century." Sowell finished. "At the same time, we have expanded bureaucracies that claim to help the poor while quietly trapping them in dependency." The control booth was silent. No producer spoke. No one interrupted. "This idea," Sowell said, "that people are helpless unless rescued by the state is not compassion. It is arrogance. It assumes that those at the bottom are incapable of learning, adapting, or overcoming unless guided by those who believe themselves morally superior." Whoopi's jaw tightened. "So your answer to systemic injustice is work harder?" she asked. "My answer," Sowell said, "is to stop telling people that their lives are controlled by forces they cannot influence. Because once you convince someone of that, you have stolen their future." The audience was no longer murmuring. They were listening. "You want to talk about systems," Sowell continued. "Let's talk about incentives. Let's talk about policies that punish marriage, discourage work, and reward dependency, then express shock when communities deteriorate." Joy scoffed. "That's a conservative talking point." "No," Sowell replied calmly. "It's an economic observation." He leaned back slightly now, hands folding again on the glass table. "I do not deny hardship," he said. "I deny the lie that hardship defines destiny." Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time since the segment began, she seemed unsure which direction to push. The audience wasn't reacting the way it usually did. There was no applause cue, no easy villain. Sowell had not raised his voice. He had not insulted anyone. He had not performed outrage. He had simply refused to accept the premise of the attack. "And here is the part that makes people uncomfortable," Sowell said quietly. "If you truly believe the system is rigged beyond repair, then you must also believe that millions of people who succeeded despite it are either anomalies or traitors to their class." The implication landed hard. "And I refuse to tell people," he concluded, "that their lives are the result of oppression alone, because that story does not empower them, it uses them." The studio was silent, no applause, no interruption. No laughter, only the sound of live television holding its breath. And in that moment, it became painfully clear, not just to the audience, but to the hosts themselves, that this was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning.